What would you do if your husband's family laughed while handing you the keys to a burned-out dye works they believed was worthless with no money and nowhere else to go? 23-year-old widow Eliza Vane entered the blackened factory, carrying only the color journal her mother had taught her to read. Beneath the soot, she discovered a strip of fabric dyed in a blue no living craftsman could reproduce. Then a wealthy family offered to purchase the ruins before sunrise and threatened to destroy Eliza's reputation if she refused. They claimed the color belonged to them, but behind a kiln sealed since the night of the fire. Eliza would find evidence proving that both the formula and the tragedy had been stolen. The laughter began in Mr. Pembroke's office before the solicitor finished reading Arthur Vane's will. Arthur's elder brother, Cedric, received the family townhouse, 3 rental properties, and controlling interest in Vane Mercantile. His younger sister inherited £1,200 and their mother's jewelry. Eliza, Arthur's widow of 11 months, received Brackenford Dye Works. Cedric covered his mouth, but his shoulders shook. The factory had burned 17 years earlier. 1 worker had died. The eastern roof had collapsed, and unpaid drainage charges still burdened the land. Brackenford villagers called it the Black Ruin. Even scavengers avoided it because the remaining walls were believed ready to fall. A fitting residence for a tradesman's daughter. Mrs. Vane said. Eliza kept her hands folded over the faded journal in her lap. Her mother, Ruth Mercer, had worked as a dyer before. Illness took her sight. She had taught Eliza to identify mordants by smell, judge water hardness by soap foam, and recognize a poorly fixed color from the stain it left beneath a fingernail. Arthur had once admired those skills. After their marriage, however, he began hiding her stained hands whenever his family visited. Mr. Pembroke placed a key and the deed before her. The property is transferred without restriction, but with all liabilities attached. You may refuse it. If she possesses any sense, she will. Cedric said. The land is worth less than the drainage debt. How much is owed? Eliza asked. £38. 11 shillings. She possessed £9 and a wedding ring Arthur's family had already asked her to return. Mrs. Vane leaned closer. Refuse the property. Surrender the ring. And I may arrange a position for you as a companion, somewhere distant. Eliza understood the offer. She could disappear quietly, or they would make certain she disappeared hungry. She signed the deed. Cedric's laughter stopped first. Bedusk. Eliza was walking through cold October rain toward Brackenford with 1 carpetbag, her mother's journal, and the factory key. The carrier had refused to take his cart down the weed-choked lane, so she completed the final mile on foot. The dye works emerged behind a row of bare elms. Its roofline sagged against the gray sky. Charred beams thrust upward like broken ribs, and rust-colored water filled the yard. Above the main entrance, the words Mercer and Vale remained faintly visible beneath newer paint. Eliza stopped. The deed called the property Brackenford Dye Works. Arthur had never mentioned another name, and Mercer had been her mother's maiden name. She crossed the yard carefully. The front key turned only after she cleared soot from the lock with a hairpin. Inside, rain tapped through holes in the roof. Broken vats stood beneath hanging strips of plaster, while the floor was buried under ash, leaves, and fragments of blue glass. Eliza chose the former counting room for shelter because part of its ceiling remained sound. While gathering splintered wood, she noticed a length of cloth trapped beneath a fallen cabinet. Most of it had blackened in the fire. One folded section, protected between 2 account boards, remained untouched. The fabric was blue, but not indigo. Under the final daylight, it shifted from deep midnight to the faint violet of a storm cloud. Eliza rubbed it between her fingers. No powder came away. She dampened one corner with rainwater, pressed it against white linen from her bag, and found no bleeding. A color that Rich should have required costly imported dye, yet the texture carried the faint mineral stiffness of a local process. She opened her mother's journal. Several pages had been cut out near the back, leaving only narrow strips beside the binding. On one strip, in Ruth's handwriting, remained 3 words: Blue survives. The hooves struck the flooded yard. Eliza concealed the cloth inside her coat as a carriage stopped outside. A broad man in a dark green greatcoat entered without knocking. She recognized Nathaniel Harcourt, head of the family whose mills controlled nearly every dye contract in the county. His gaze moved from Eliza to the open journal. "I heard the deed changed hands," he said. "I will give you £50 for this property tonight. The land is supposedly worthless. To you, it is dangerous. To me, it removes an eyesore." When Eliza did not answer, his pleasant expression hardened. "Take the money, Mrs. Vane. If you begin pretending to understand what happened here, people may remember why your mother left Brackenford in disgrace." Eliza's breath caught. "You knew her." Harcourt looked toward the ruined dye hall. For one instant, fear crossed his face. Then, something heavy shifted behind the sealed kiln wall. Harcourt heard it too. He placed a second key upon the table, a key identical to hers, and said, "You are not the only person who can enter this factory." Eliza did not touch the second key. "Then the locks will be changed tomorrow." Harcourt smiled, as though she had made a childish threat. "With what money? That is my concern. Everything in Brackenford eventually becomes my concern." He left without taking back the key, his boots making black half-moons across the wet floor. Eliza waited until the carriage lamps vanished before approaching the kiln. The noise did not come again. She held her candle near the bricks and found a narrow trail through the soot where one section had moved against another. Yet the mortar was hard, and the iron fire door had warped shut. Trying to open it alone in darkness would be foolish. She returned to the counting room, wedged a broken spindle beneath the door handle, and slept in her cloak with the journal under her head. At dawn, she discovered muddy prints outside the eastern wall. They ended beside a drain choked with nettles. Although no prints led away, someone had either entered the ground or carefully brushed out the return trail. Eliza followed the drain until the yard water reached her ankles. The flooding was not caused by rain alone. 3 stone channels descended from the hill, but a newer brick barrier diverted all of them toward the factory. Harcourt's upper mill stood beyond the ridge. If its owners had altered the watercourse, the debt-burdening Brackenford might not legally belong to her. She marked the channels in the margin of an old invoice, then walked into the village. The blacksmith refused her request before she finished speaking. The carpenter claimed his order book was full until spring. At the general shop, conversation stopped when she introduced herself. Only a thin boy carrying coal continued moving. He stared at the blue smudge on her glove and nearly dropped his sack. "Where did you get that color?" he whispered. His name was Thomas Reed, and his father, Samuel, had died in the factory fire. Thomas had been an infant then. His mother had always insisted Samuel was not careless, though the official inquiry blamed him for leaving oil beside the furnace. When Eliza showed Thomas only the burned edge of the fabric, his face tightened. He had seen the color once in a wooden box his mother kept locked beneath her bed. Mrs. Reed lived in 2 rooms behind the cooper's yard and received Eliza with open suspicion. She softened only when Eliza spoke Ruth Mercer's name. "Your mother tried to save Samuel's reputation," the widow said. "That was why Harcourt ruined hers." From the locked box, she removed a spool wound with the same strange blue thread. A paper label remained tied to its core M and V. Trial 9. Fixed without foreign indigo. The handwriting was Ruth's. Mrs. Reed explained that Mercer and Vale had not been 2 men. As Eliza assumed, Ruth Mercer and a chemist named Agnes Vale had founded the works together. They developed colors from local minerals, vesta bark, and cultivated plants so small cloth makers would not depend on expensive import. Samuel maintained their boilers and water channels. Nathaniel Harcourt's father offered to buy the formula. When the women refused, orders vanished. Suppliers withdrew credit, and rumors spread that their dyes poisoned children. Then came the fire. Mrs. Reed said Samuel ran inside because Miss Vale was still there. They found his body. They never found hers. My mother never told me she was carrying you. Harcourt's men said they would accuse her of setting the fire if she remained. She left before you were born. Eliza felt the room narrow around her. Her mother had died, believing the factory and her own name were lost. Why did Arthur own it, she asked. Mrs. Reed's expression hardened again. After the fire, Ruth's share had been transferred through a debt settlement to Vane Mercantile, which had financed some equipment. Arthur later acquired the ruined property for a token sum. Perhaps he had intended to sell it to Harcourt. Perhaps he had left it to Eliza from guilt. The answer had died with him. Mrs. Reed allowed her to keep the labeled spool only after Eliza promised to clear Samuel's name if she found proof. Thomas returned with her to the factory. He possessed little experience but strong hands, and he accepted 6 pence to clear the counting room and help fit a temporary door bar. Together they lifted fallen plaster, covered the roof opening with salvaged sailcloth, and drained the shallowest corner of the yard. The work revealed a row of square stones beneath the mud, each marked with a shallow groove. Eliza recognized them as lids for settling tanks. The main drainage system had not vanished. It had been deliberately buried. At sunset, Thomas tested the kiln bricks with the blacksmith's hammer he had borrowed without explaining its purpose. Most gave a dull, solid note. 7 bricks near the floor answered with a hollow ring. Before they could remove them, the parish constable arrived carrying a folded notice. Nathaniel Harcourt had reported the factory structurally unsafe and accused Eliza of employing a miner in dangerous conditions. She had 48 hours to leave until an inspection could be made. Thomas flushed. "I'm 19. The constable looked embarrassed, but did not withdraw the notice. Harcourt served as a magistrate and funded repairs to the constable's house. Eliza read the wording twice. It prohibited occupancy in the Eastern Dye Hall, not the counting room, yard, or Western workshop. Whoever wrote it assumed a frightened widow would not notice the distinction. "Tell Mr. Harcourt, I shall obey every word," she said. The constable left. Thomas grinned for the first time. That evening they worked from the western side of the kiln, beyond the prohibited hall. Removing the hollow bricks exposed not a chamber but the end of an iron rail. It ran into the wall at ankle height. Thomas pulled while Eliza cleared hardened ash from its groove. With a groan, an entire section of kiln casing shifted 3 inches. Cold air breathed through the gap, carrying the scent of wet stone and something sharper copper, vinegar, and old oak. A narrow passage descended behind it. On the first step lay a woman's leather shoe, cracked with age but untouched by fire. Eliza raised her candle. Far below, something blue reflected the flame. Thomas wanted to descend first, but Eliza stopped him. The passage had been closed for 17 years, and stale air could kill, as certainly as falling stone. She lowered the candle on a length of twine. The flame weakened near the bottom but did not go out. They opened the outer doors and waited, while cold night air moved through the gap. Only then did Eliza tie a cloth across her mouth and begin down the steps. There were 23 of them, cut into the natural sandstone below the factory. The blue reflection came from a row of glazed tiles along the lowest wall. Unlike the scorched floor above, the chamber remained dry. 3 oak casks rested on stone cradles. Copper pipes passed through their lids and joined a narrow cistern fed by a spring. The arrangement was not a treasure vault. It was a laboratory. Thomas found a lamp sealed beneath an inverted jar. Eliza filled it with oil from her own bottle and lit it. Its broader glow revealed shelves of stoppered bottles, a balance with ivory weights, and 4 small dyeing vats lined with pale ceramic. A dark blue crust coated the rim of one vat. She softened a flake with vinegar and touched it to a scrap of wool. The color opened slowly, not bright at first, then deepened as the fibers met the air. Ruth had once told her that a true formula was not a list of ingredients. It was a sequence of temperatures, intervals, water conditions, and judgments made by the hand. Anyone could steal a recipe. Few could steal understanding. On a work table lay a copper plate stamped with the words, Mercer-Vale process. Application deferred. The remaining space had been scratched violently, as if someone had tried to remove a registration number. Thomas searched beneath the table and discovered the source of the earlier noise. A counterweighted storage frame had slipped when rainwater entered an upper shaft. The frame carried a dozen narrow drawers. Most were empty. One contained burned scraps of paper. Another held mineral samples wrapped in linen. And a third contained a child's knitted mitten. Eliza knew it immediately. Her mother had preserved its mate in her sewing box until the day she died. On the cuff, worked in faded yellow thread, was the letter E. Ruth had been preparing for her child while she worked below the factory. Eliza pressed the mitten against her palm. Her mother had not merely known this place. She had built its work around the future she believed Eliza would inherit. A sound from the passage made Thomas seize the hammer. It was only displaced grit. But Eliza understood the danger. Harcourt had a key, and knew a hidden structure existed. They could not examine everything tonight. She wrapped the copper plate and 2 mineral packets in oilcloth, returned the shoe to the step, and arranged loose ash across the entrance, so footprints would reveal an intruder. Before leaving, she noticed a thin iron pipe continuing through the chamber's northern wall. It was warm, somewhere beyond the sealed masonry. Water still moved through machinery that had supposedly died 17 years ago. By morning, the parish inspector had arrived. Mr. Abel Forsyth was a careful man with weak eyes and a wool scarf wound twice around his neck. Harcourt accompanied him, along with Cedric Vane. Cedric claimed concern for his sister-in-law's safety, though he had never visited the works before she inherited them. Eliza kept both men in the yard while Forsyth examined the counting room and western workshop. She showed him the deed, the exact wording of the constable's notice, and the repairs completed by Thomas. Forsyth confirmed that the western wall was stable enough for temporary occupation if 3 roof braces were installed. Harcourt interrupted repeatedly, urging him to condemn the entire property. The inspector finally removed his spectacles and asked whether Harcourt wished to conduct the inspection himself. Cedric laughed, but the humor vanished when Forsyth requested the original drainage plan. Harcourt said, "No plan survived." Eliza produced her sketch of the diverted channels. "The flooding appears to originate above my northern boundary," she said. Forsyth followed the stone courses with his eyes. He would not rule on ownership, but he ordered the channel gates kept unchanged until a survey could be completed. Harcourt's jaw tightened. The water itself had become evidence. After the men left, Cedric remained. He offered Eliza £100 for the deed. Twice Harcourt's first offer. When she refused, he stepped closer and lowered his voice. Arthur had purchased Brackenford on Harcourt's advice. During Arthur's final illness, Harcourt visited him 3 times. Cedric claimed those meetings concerned shipping contract, but Eliza remembered Arthur waking from fever and asking whether blue could burn. At the time, she thought he was delirious. "Why did he leave the factory to me?" she asked. Cedric glanced at the blackened sign above the entrance. "Perhaps he wished to punish you." "Then why are you desperate to take the punishment back?" He called her ungrateful and departed. That afternoon, Thomas brought Gideon Price, a retired millwright whose hands were crooked from 40 years of work. Gideon had helped install the factory's water system when Ruth and Agnes opened the works. He refused to enter the hidden chamber, but he studied Eliza's sketch and confirmed that the spring pipe once drove a small agitation wheel beneath the laboratory. Constant movement kept certain mineral baths evenly mixed. After the fire, Harcourt purchased the uphill water rights and blocked the main channel. Gideon believed the underground wheel had stopped. When Eliza told him the pipe remained warm, he stared toward the kiln. Then someone kept a second feed open. He said, Gideon agreed to brace the workshop in exchange for meals and a promise that any restored business would employ Samuel Reed's son fairly. Eliza spent £3 on timber and nails, £1 6 on lime, lamp oil, and food, and 8 shillings on a new lock. Her money fell below £5. The drainage debt remained. She could not survive on discovery alone. She needed income. The surviving western room contained 2 small copper vats and a brick stove, with Thomas cleaning, Gideon repairing the flue, and Mrs. Reed washing undamaged tools. Eliza reclaimed it 1 square yard at a time. She sold her wedding ring for £4, 12 shillings, and used the money to purchase wool yarn from 3 village women whose usual buyer had reduced his price. Rather than attempt the mysterious blue, she prepared a reliable brown-black dye from alder bark, iron liquor, and walnut husks. It was ordinary work, but ordinary work done well could earn trust. Her first batch failed. The diverted water contained too much dissolved lime, and the yarn emerged, streaked gray. Eliza had spent nearly £1 on materials she could not replace. For 1 hour, she sat beside the cooling vat, ashamed of having believed knowledge alone could overcome every obstacle. Then she remembered Ruth judging water by soap foam. Eliza tested the spring pipe from the hidden chamber. Its water was softer and carried a faint metallic warmth, but it ran too slowly for a full vat. Gideon helped her construct a settling barrel filled with clean sand and charcoal. They collected rainwater beneath the repaired roof, blended it with the spring flow, and tried again. The second batch dried to an even, durable black. Mrs. Reed took 2 skeins to the weekly market. She returned with 6 orders and news that Harcourt's agent had warned merchants that Brackenford dyes carried disease. Eliza invited the village midwife, the schoolmaster, and Forsyth to observe her process. She boiled drinking water in one vessel, dye liquor in another, stored mordants in locked boxes, and recorded every material used. The schoolmaster rubbed a wet white cloth across the finished yarn and found no stain. The rumor weakened because Eliza answered it with visible practice rather than anger. Over the next 3 weeks, the western workshop began to breathe again. The roof still leaked in 2 places. The yard remained flooded, and much of the eastern hall was unsafe, but smoke rose from one sound chimney each morning. Thomas learned to hold temperature by reading the movement of steam. Mrs. Reed organized accounts and discovered she possessed a sharper memory for debts than any clerk Eliza had known. Gideon repaired the small winding machine with parts salvaged from the ruins. Eliza paid modest wages every Saturday. Even when doing so, left her own purse nearly empty. Villagers who had crossed the road to avoid her began bringing damaged cloth, bundles of bark, and questions. Not everyone changed. The blacksmith still refused her trade, and Harcourt's mill foreman watched the gate from the hill, yet work made the factory less easy to describe as cursed. At night, Eliza studied the underground chamber. The copper plate was not enough to establish a legal claim. It proved that someone intended to register a process, not who completed it or whether Harcourt later purchased it. The mineral packets carried symbols rather than names. The blue cloth was extraordinary but silent. She needed the missing pages from Ruth's journal or Agnes Vale's records. The hidden drawers offered only fragments until Thomas discovered that the child's mitten contained something stiff beneath its lining. Eliza carefully opened 3 stitches. Inside was a strip of thin tin engraved with a sequence 492. Tsiyu. San Ba Lu. Gideon recognized it as neither a boiler setting nor a loom count. Mrs. Reed noticed that the digits used every number from 1 through 9 exactly once. Ruth's surviving journal contained small groups of 9 colored squares, besides several unfinished trials. Eliza had assumed they were sample plans. When she arranged the journal's color names according to the tin sequence, their first letters formed a sentence, Vale below, North Run. The northern wall of the laboratory bordered the old underground watercourse. They drained the cistern, removed a corroded screen, and found a crawl passage above the flow. Thomas entered with a rope around his waist, while Eliza held the other end. 12 feet inside, he found an iron dispatch box wedged on a ledge. Its lid bore a melted patch where someone had tried to burn it, but water had reached the box first. Inside were rolled linen sheets rather than paper. Mineral ink had preserved the writing. The first sheet was a partnership agreement between Ruth Mercer and Agnes Vale. Each woman owned half the process, equipment, and land purchased for the works. The second was a letter from a London patent agent acknowledging receipt of their preliminary specification. The third was a sworn statement by Samuel Reed. 3 days before the fire, Samuel had seen Edmund Harcourt enter the lower laboratory using a duplicate key and copy measurements from Trial 9. The most important sheet was missing. A tie remained around empty space, labeled Statement of A. Val, to be opened if harm occurs. They had found proof of theft, but not proof of what happened during the fire. When Eliza emerged from the chamber, she smelled smoke. This time it did not come from the stove. Flames crawled along the western workshop door, where someone had poured lamp oil across the threshold. Thomas ran for a bucket, but Eliza stopped him from opening the door into the fire. Gideon shoved a wet wool blanket against the lower gap. Mrs. Reed climbed through the counting room window and shouted for help. Eliza led the others through the kiln passage to a narrow ventilation hatch Gideon remembered from construction. They escaped into the flooded yard as villagers arrived carrying pails. The fire was extinguished before it reached the roof braces. But the new door, a week of finished yarn, and most of Eliza's purchased bark were destroyed. Constable Avery found boot marks in the mud and a broken brass button stamped with an H. Harcourt's mill guards wore buttons of that design. Yet Harcourt arrived before sunrise with 2 witnesses who swore every guard had remained at his warehouse overnight. He expressed sorrow, offered Eliza £200 for the ruins, and suggested that careless workers might have caused a second fire, just as Samuel Reed caused the first. Thomas struck him. The blow split Harcourt's lip and gave him exactly what he wanted. By noon, Thomas was locked in the parish cell on a charge of assault, and Harcourt had petitioned the magistrates to close Brackenford as a danger to the village. Eliza stood inside the burned workshop with £4, 3 damaged vats, no finished goods, and 40 workers' orders she could no longer fill. On the blackened doorframe, someone had scratched 5 words before setting the fire. "Your mother ran. You should too." Eliza read them until grief hardened into purpose. Ruth had run because she was carrying a child and had no proof strong enough to defeat Harcourt. Eliza now possessed Samuel's statement, the partnership agreement, the copper plate, and a village beginning to remember what honest work looked like. She would not surrender the factory. But first she had 48 hours to free Thomas, stop the closure, and discover which person inside Brackenford had told Harcourt they had opened the northern watercourse. Eliza began with the one person Harcourt believed too frightened to oppose him, Constable Avery. She asked to see Thomas, and when Avery refused, she placed Samuel Reed's sworn statement on his desk. Samuel's account did not prove who had set the new fire, but it proved that Harcourt's father had entered the hidden laboratory before the old one. Avery read it twice. His face changed when he reached the witness line. His own late father had signed the statement. "He never told me." Avery murmured, "Perhaps he told the wrong man." Eliza replied, "The constable could not release Thomas without a magistrate, but he allowed Mrs. Reed to bring food and agreed to preserve the brass button instead of surrendering it to Harcourt." Eliza then went door to door among the people whose orders had burned. She expected anger. Instead, the first woman asked whether the advance she had paid could help repair the workshop. Eliza refused to keep money for undelivered work. By evening, 23 customers had signed a declaration that they had inspected Brackenford's process and considered the works safely managed before the arson. Gideon added a structural statement. Forsyth attached his inspection. The schoolmaster copied everything in a clear hand, making 3 sets so no single fire could erase them. At the hearing the following morning, Harcourt sat beside Magistrate Pell, as though the decision had already been made. He described Eliza as an inexperienced widow, playing with corrosive substances inside a ruin. Cedric testified that Arthur had considered her emotional judgment unreliable. Eliza let him finish. Then she asked Cedric whether Arthur had ever visited Brackenford after purchasing it. Cedric said no. Then how did he know there was a lower laboratory, she asked. Cedric stared at her. She had not said Arthur knew, but his fear answered before his mouth did. Harcourt interrupted, claiming the question was irrelevant. Eliza presented the villagers' declaration and Forsyth's report. The magistrate could not dismiss so many named witnesses. He ordered the eastern hall closed, but permitted work in the western room once the burned doorway was replaced. Harcourt's petition failed. Thomas remained charged with assault. Yet Harcourt offered to withdraw it if Eliza sold the property. Thomas begged her through the cell bars to accept. His mother did not. Mrs. Reed sold the silver brooch from her wedding dress to pay his bail. Samuel lost his name because we were afraid. She said, "I will not purchase my son's freedom with the same silence." Thomas returned to Brackenford, bruised by shame, and promised never again to give Harcourt the violence he wanted. The next challenge was survival. 40 orders had been destroyed, and Eliza's remaining money could not replace the yarn. The village women proposed bringing their own undyed wool and paying only for the work. A tailor in the next town agreed to accept the proven black at a lower margin. Gideon rebuilt the door from scorched oak, reinforced with 2 iron straps donated by the blacksmith, who delivered them after dark, so Harcourt's foreman would not see. Small acts accumulated. Within 10 days, the stove burned again. Eliza worked from before sunrise until the final vat cooled, but she did not touch the hidden blue. She refused to gamble scarce materials until she understood it. Every night she studied Ruth's journal beside the copper plate. The formula fragments referenced 9 mineral lots, a living bath, and a final quieting stage. The term was not used in ordinary dyeing. Ruth had written that blue survived the sentence cut from the page, and the missing final word mattered. Thomas suggested fire. Gideon suggested time. Mrs. Reed suggested shame. Because Ruth had survived that, Eliza tested each possibility against the process and rejected them. The answer came from the factory itself. During a hard frost, the spring pipe stopped feeling warm. The blue crust in the underground vat dulled from violet blue to flat gray. When the weather softened, the warmth returned, and so did the violet sheen. The northern water was passing through a bed of mineral-bearing stone that altered with temperature. Agnes and Ruth had not merely discovered a pigment. They had designed a controlled water system that made a local mineral stable on cloth. Harcourt could steal the measured ingredients and still fail without the underground channel. That explained why he wanted the land more than the written formula. It also explained the drainage diversions. By flooding the yard and controlling the upper gates, his family had hidden the true watercourse while making the works appear worthless. Gideon mapped the old pipes from memory. One branch ran north beneath the ridge, and another turned east toward a cottage once used by the gatekeeper. The cottage no longer stood, but its foundation remained in a sheep field, now owned by Harcourt. Eliza could not enter without permission. She instead searched parish rate books. The schoolmaster helped her compare 17 years of entries for 3 years after the fire. The gatekeeper's cottage was listed as occupied by A. Vale. On easy misspelling of Vale, Agnes may have survived. The next entry recorded the tenant removed to St. Orison's house, a charitable residence 30 miles away. Eliza spent nearly her last shilling sending an inquiry. The reply came 6 days later. Agnes Vale had lived at St. Orison's under the name Anne Vale until her death 8 years before. She had suffered burns to one arm and rarely spoke of her former life. Among the few possessions recorded at her death was a locked wooden color box, claimed by a niece named Miriam Wren. The address was now outdated. Harcourt learned of the inquiry before Eliza could pursue it. Someone had indeed carried information from Brackenford. Eliza laid a simple trap. She told Gideon that the mineral samples would be moved to the church vestry, told Mrs. Reed they would go to Forsyth's office, told Thomas they would be buried beneath the counting room, and told the blacksmith they would remain in the laboratory. That night, 2 Harcourt guards broke into the counting room and dug beneath the floor. Thomas's version had reached them. Eliza did not accuse him. She asked whom he had told. Pale with horror, he admitted mentioning it to his sweetheart, Lucy Dane, a laundress at Harcourt House. Lucy had promised secrecy. When confronted, Lucy wept and confessed that Harcourt's housekeeper had found Thomas's note in her apron and threatened to dismiss both Lucy and her widowed sister. The leak had not been betrayal but coercion. Eliza moved Lucy and her sister into the repaired rooms above the western workshop, giving them work, washing yarn. More importantly, she changed how information was shared. No one person outside Eliza would again know the location of every piece of evidence. The trap also gave Constable Avery grounds to act. He arrested the 2 guards inside the factory. One remained loyal to Harcourt, but the younger man, Daniel Pike, learned that his employer denied ordering the break-in and refused to pay for counsel. Pike then admitted that Harcourt's foreman had given him the old duplicate key and instructed him to search for Vale's box. He also identified the arsonist as the other guard. The case against Harcourt was still indirect, but his shield had begun to crack. Harcourt responded through money. He purchased Eliza's drainage debt from the parish creditor and demanded immediate payment with accumulated fees, raising the sum to £41. If she failed, he intended to seek seizure of movable equipment. Mr. Pembroke confirmed that the demand was lawful under the assignment, though the disputed cause of the flooding could later alter liability. Later would not save the vats now. Eliza had 7 days. The restored business earned pounds slowly, not 41 at once. Cedric arrived with the money in a leather purse. He said he would pay the debt if Eliza signed a deed, giving him a half interest. She asked whether Harcourt had sent him. Cedric denied it badly. Eliza then produced a page from Arthur's private account book that Mrs. Reed had found pasted beneath the burned cabinet. It recorded 3 payments from Harcourt Trading to Arthur, each dated after his visits during Arthur's illness. Beside the last, Arthur had written, "Not enough to make a lie become truth." Cedric stared at his brother's handwriting. The arrogance drained from him. Arthur had apparently accepted money to locate the hidden laboratory, then discovered what Harcourt's family had done. He bought Brackenford to control access, but illness overtook him before he decided whether to expose the fraud or profit from it. Leaving the property to Eliza may have been his final attempt to place it in hands Harcourt could not purchase. Cedric still wanted the work, but now his motive included fear that the payments could implicate Vane Mercantile. "Help me prove Arthur refused the final bargain," Eliza said. and his name need not be remembered, only for taking the first 2 payments. Cedric left the purse on the table without conditions. Eliza refused it. If Harcourt later claimed Cedric had purchased an interest, the property chain would become clouded. Instead, she asked Cedric to buy 41 pounds of finished cloth in advance, at a fair wholesale price. Documented by invoice, he would receive goods over 6 months. Brackenford would earn its rescue rather than owe it. Cedric reluctantly agreed. The debt was paid 1 hour before the deadline. Harcourt tore the receipt in half when Eliza showed it to him, apparently forgetting that the creditor retained the matching counterfoil. His temper, once hidden beneath courtesy, was becoming public. With the works temporarily secure, Eliza traveled to St. Orison's. She took Mrs. Reed, both for companionship and because Samuel's name belonged in whatever truth they found. The matron remembered Agnes as a woman who woke screaming whenever she smelled lamp oil. Agnes's burned arm never fully straightened, but she worked in the garden and taught residents to make inks from walnut, iron, and berries. She would not accuse Harcourt because she believed Ruth and Samuel had died. No one had told her Ruth escaped. Before Agnes died, she entrusted the color box to Miriam, who was not a niece by blood, but a former resident Agnes had trained. Miriam now taught at a girls' school in Larkhaven. They found her in a classroom where 12 students were grinding oat galls for ink. Miriam listened to Eliza's account, then unlocked a cupboard and removed a plain beech box stained at the corners with blue. Inside lay glass rods, fabric trials, a brass seal, and Agnes Vale's statement. Agnes had written it 2 days after the old fire. Edmund Harcourt entered the laboratory seeking the completed process. When Agnes refused, he overturned a lamp during the struggle. Samuel rushed inside and opened the emergency sluice, flooding the lower passage and saving Agnes. But a falling beam trapped him. Agnes escaped through the north run carrying her statement and the color box. She hid in the gatekeeper's cottage while Harcourt's men searched the roads. When she learned Ruth had fled and Samuel had been blamed, terror silenced her. The statement named a second witness, Jonathan Vane, Arthur's father, who had come to collect a loan payment and saw Edmund leaving the factory with copied notes minutes before smoke appeared. Jonathan later acquired Ruth's property share through debt court rather than testify. The Vane family's fortune and the Harcourt dye empire had both grown from the ruin. Eliza felt sick as she read. Her husband inherited not only land but concealed guilt. Mrs. Reed stood by the window for a long time. Samuel saved her. She finally said, "He did not burn the works." Miriam offered the statement freely, but Eliza asked her to come to Brackenford and testify to its chain of custody. A document found at the convenient moment would be attacked as a forgery. Miriam agreed after seeing Ruth's mitten and journal. Agnes had told her that if anyone ever arrived with the matching mitten, the box belonged to that person. On their return, they found the factory yard dry for the first time. Gideon had cleared 2 settling channels under Forsyth's supervision. The exposed stones revealed boundary marks cut before Harcourt purchased the upper water rights. They showed that the spring head and control gate lay inside Brackenford's original parcel, not Harcourt's field. A surveyor appointed by the county confirmed the line. Harcourt's father had diverted water originating on Mercer-Vale land, then charged the factory for damage caused by the diversion. The finding opened a claim for restitution far larger than the debt. Eliza did not celebrate. Harcourt would now understand that losing meant more than surrendering a formula. He faced exposure, repayment, and perhaps criminal prosecution for the recent arson and break-in. A cornered man with money could still cause terrible harm. She placed Agnes's statement with Mr. Pembroke, the partnership agreement with Forsyth, and Samuel's copy with the schoolmaster. The color box remained at the girls' school until the hearing. The copper plate was hidden somewhere. Only Mrs. Reed knew. 3 nights later, the upper reservoir gate was opened during heavy rain. A wall of water descended the diverted channels toward Brackenford. Thomas heard the roar first. He rang the factory bell, while Eliza ran to the underground laboratory. The current entered the north run with enough force to tear the iron screen free. Water climbed the steps, lifting casks and smashing bottles against the stone. The evidence had been divided, but the laboratory at Martin, the one thing, proving how the process depended on the spring, could be destroyed. Gideon shouted for Eliza to leave. Instead, she waded to the agitation wheel and pulled the emergency lever Samuel had used 17 years before. It did not move. Rust held it fast. Thomas reached her with a crowbar. Together they forced the lever down. Somewhere beneath them, an ancient gate opened. Water reversed through the eastern relief channel and burst across the abandoned yard rather than the occupied workshop. The pressure threw Eliza against the wall. Thomas dragged her up the steps as the lowest ceiling stones collapsed. Outside, villagers formed a line carrying sandbags. Even the blacksmith came openly this time. They saved the western building, but half the laboratory filled with rubble. Gideon found the upper gate chain freshly cut. Harcourt claimed lightning had damaged it. There had been no lightning. At sunrise, Eliza looked across the mud and believed for the first time that restoration might be impossible. The hidden chamber had taken Ruth and Agnes years to build. One night had broken its heart. Miriam knelt beside a pool where faint blue swirls moved over brown water. Agnes said the process was never meant to belong to a room. She said, it belonged to anyone willing to learn it honestly. Eliza realized she had been protecting the laboratory, as though preservation alone could defeat theft. Harcourt's family had maintained power because knowledge remained secret, scarce, and easy to destroy. The answer was not to hide the blue better. It was to teach the process so widely that no one could steal it again. The first lesson took place beneath a temporary awning because the workshop could not hold everyone who came. Eliza invited dyers, weavers, laundresses, apprentices, and 3 girls from Miriam's school. She did not reveal the final blue formula because she had not yet reconstructed it. But she taught water testing, safe handling of mordants, and the reason sequence mattered more than a copied list. Miriam demonstrated Agnes's mineral inks. Mrs. Reed read Samuel's statement aloud. The factory that had been used to isolate 2 women became a place of shared knowledge before its walls were whole. Harcourt called the gathering theft disguised as charity. Through a London solicitor, he filed for an injunction, claiming the blue process was a Harcourt trade secret used commercially for 16 years. His mills produced a dark blue sold under the name Imperial Night. It resembled the surviving cloth in poor light, though Eliza noticed that Harcourt's sample blackened where it folded and bled green when washed with weak vinegar. The stolen measurements had allowed his family to imitate the appearance, but not the stability of Mercer-Vale blue. Harcourt argued that long use proved ownership. Eliza's documents showed earlier creation, but the scratched copper plate and deferred patent left room for attack. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Until then, the court prohibited both parties from selling fabric represented as the disputed blue. Harcourt could continue selling his ordinary colors. Brackenford, which had never yet sold the blue, lost nothing immediate. The order nevertheless served his purpose by frightening merchants away. Cedric's advance order kept wages paid, but winter increased coal costs, and repairs consumed every spare shilling. Eliza chose priorities ruthlessly. The eastern hall was fenced off rather than rebuilt. The counting room received a sound roof but no plaster. The yard channels were lined with salvaged stone. A hand pump replaced the ruined underground agitation wheel for small trials. She maintained a ledger on the wall where every worker could see income, costs, and wages. Ruth and Agnes had been vulnerable partly because creditors and partners held information separately. Brackenford's new workers would know the condition of their own livelihood. Reconstructing Trial 9 required hundreds of small tests. Agnes's box contained numbered samples, but no complete recipe. Ruth's journal preserved temperatures and descriptions of color, rather than degrees heat until the surface trembles. Cool until a hand may rest against copper for the length of a hymn verse. Agnes recorded mineral weights. While Ruth recorded the behavior of cloth, neither document worked alone. Eliza combined them. The local blue mineral was not valuable ore but waste drawn from a narrow seam beside the spring. Ground alone, it produced a dull gray. Fermented with woad stems and alder ash, it formed a living bath that had to be fed in small portions. Too much air killed it. Too little prevented the color from opening on the cloth. The warm spring stabilized the bath, while a final rinse removed the green cast. They failed 27 times. Some samples faded overnight. Some turned brittle. One emerged beautifully blue, and then stained every hand that touched it. Each failure cost material and time. Harcourt's agents bought several discarded samples from the rubbish cart, then announced that Brackenford's secret color washed away. Eliza stopped discarding trials. She hung every failed strip in the workshop with its number and caused visitors could see that she concealed neither risk nor error. The display became more persuasive than any advertisement. On the 31st trial, the wool dried to a blue deeper than the surviving thread. Eliza exposed half to steam, scrubbed another section with soap, laid a third in weak acid, and placed the last in winter sunlight for 10 clear days. All remained blue. Yet something was wrong. The original cloth changed subtly from midnight to violet. As it moved, trial 31 remained flat. Ruth's cut sentence returned to Eliza Blue, survives the. She examined the journal's torn edge under magnification. A faint downward stroke remained after the word, the. It could have begun rain. River. Orense. Miriam brought Agnes's classroom notes, which included an exercise asking students to make ink survive the truth of daylight. Eliza tried daylight as the missing word, but the chemical sequence offered no final action. Then Mrs. Reed placed the original spool beside trial 31. The old thread appeared more violet because it had been spun with wool from sheep grazing on heather-rich moorland. Natural oils and trace plant residue affected the surface. The formula was not incomplete. The material was different. Ruth's sentence had likely been philosophical rather than procedural. Blue survives the light. Harcourt had spent 17 years hunting a secret final ingredient that did not exist. Eliza purchased a small quantity of moorland wool and repeated the process. Trial 34 matched the spool. She wept without embarrassment when the first length dried. The color did not represent sudden wealth. It represented two women's work understood again through patience rather than possession. Before the hearing, Eliza needed independent tests. She sent sealed samples of the original spool, Harcourt's Imperial Night, and trial 34 to 3 institutions under numbers rather than names: a textile guild, a hospital laundry, and a naval outfitter. Each tested resistance to light, soap, salt water, and friction. The reports agreed. The original and trial 34 behaved almost identically. Harcourt's blue faded, bled, and weakened wool after repeated washing. The guild noted that the stable samples required a process unlike any registered by Harcourt. He learned of the reports and changed tactics. A newspaper friendly to his family accused Eliza of exploiting her mother's tragedy, employing women in unsafe labor, and manufacturing evidence with a disgruntled criminal named Thomas Reed. The article mentioned Thomas's assault, but not the break-in that provoked it, or the charge Harcourt later withdrew. Eliza refused to answer through another newspaper. She opened Brackenford's doors for a public inspection. Visitors saw locked chemical stores, ventilation, fire buckets, separate eating rooms, and the wage ledger. Lucy Dane spoke about Harcourt's housekeeper coercing her. Daniel Pike repeated his confession before Avery and Forsyth. Harcourt's foreman then disappeared. His absence harmed Harcourt more than any denial. The final blow arrived from an unexpected source. Mrs. Vane came to Brackenford in a closed carriage. Veiled against recognition, she carried Arthur's dispatch case. Cedric had told her about the account entries. After Arthur's death, she found a sealed letter beneath the lining, but hid it to protect the family name. The letter was addressed to Eliza. Arthur confessed that Harcourt paid him to locate Agnes Vale's evidence. Arthur bought the ruined works, believing its underground spring might be commercially valuable. After discovering Jonathan Vane's involvement, he intended to sell the documents back to Harcourt. Then he read Ruth's journal and learned that Eliza was Ruth Mercer's daughter. Shame prevented him from telling her while alive. He amended his will instead and enclosed a rubbing of the copper plate made before Harcourt scratched it. The rubbing preserved the full registration reference. Arthur wrote that the matching preliminary specification remained in the London agent's archive under that number. "Why did you keep this?" Eliza asked. Mrs. Vane looked older than she had at the will reading. "Because I preferred a dead son, remembered kindly, to a living woman treated justly." She did not ask forgiveness. She placed the case on the table and left. The archive produced the original specification bearing Ruth's and Agnes's signatures. Witnessed by Samuel and Jonathan Vane, it described the local mineral, controlled spring water, and living bath in enough detail to match Eliza's reconstruction. A handwritten note by the agent recorded that formal filing was delayed because an unnamed industrial buyer challenged the women's right to the land. The buyer's correspondence carried Edmund Harcourt's seal. Eliza now possessed documentary provenance. Witness chains. physical process, and independent test results. Still, Harcourt remained dangerous. On the night before the hearing, he came alone to Brackenford. Snow lay thinly across the yard. The factory windows glowed with the lamps of workers completing Cedric's black cloth order. Harcourt offered £5,000, more money than Eliza had ever imagined, owning she could keep the western building, he said, but must transfer the spring rights, blue process, and all claims regarding the old fire. He would also establish an annuity for Mrs. Reed and provide Thomas a position overseas. You can repair every roof tomorrow, he said, or spend years fighting over stones. Eliza understood the temptation. £5,000 could make Brackenford beautiful. It could also make its purpose hollow. Harcourt would own the water, bury Samuel's vindication, and dismiss Ruth and Agnes as sources purchased after death. No, she said. He studied the workers visible through the window. They will leave when you can no longer pay them. Then they will leave, knowing what their work was worth. His calm finally broke. He seized her wrist and said the magistrates belonged to families like his, not women who mistook labor for power. Thomas stepped from the doorway but did not strike him. Behind Thomas stood Avery, Gideon, Miriam, Mrs. Reed, and 6 workers. Eliza had not met Harcourt alone. Everyone heard the threat. Harcourt released her and walked into the snow. The hearing filled the county assembly room. Textile merchants occupied one side, Brackenford workers the other. Harcourt arrived with 2 solicitors and boxes of business records. His case rested on continuous manufacture, investment, and commercial reputation. Even if Ruth and Agnes conducted early experiments, his counsel argued, Harcourt Mills had perfected and brought the color to market. Eliza's claim was sentimental resurrection, not ownership. Eliza's solicitor, paid jointly by Cedric and the Textile Guild, built the answer in sequence. The partnership deed proved Ruth and Agnes owned the works and their inventions. The agent's preliminary specification dated their controlled water process before Harcourt's first blue sales. Samuel's statement and Agnes's later testimony described Edmund's unlawful entry and the fire. Parish records established Agnes's survival and the custody of her box. Arthur's letter and account entries demonstrated Nathaniel Harcourt's recent efforts to buy evidence. The survey proved Harcourt diverted water originating inside Brackenford's boundary. Independent tests showed that Harcourt's commercial dye was not the Mercer-Vale process at all, but an inferior imitation. Then Eliza demonstrated the color. 3 lengths of wool hung behind a curtain. 1 was the original spool expanded into a woven sample by Miriam's students. 1 was Brackenford Trial 34. 1 was Harcourt Imperial Night. They looked similar at first. Eliza washed each in warm soap before the assembly. Harcourt's released a green cloud. She rubbed all 3 across white linen. Harcourt's left a dark streak. Finally, assistants opened the shutters. Winter daylight crossed the cloth. Ruth's original and Brackenford's reconstruction shifted toward violet. Harcourt's remained almost black. A murmur moved through the room. Harcourt claimed Eliza had altered his sample. She offered sealed duplicates from shops in 3 towns, each purchased by different witnesses. His own insistence on public accusation had created the need for abundant proof. Onebi 1. The shopkeepers confirmed their seals. Magistrate Pell could no longer protect Harcourt without exposing himself. The court dissolved the injunction, recognized the Mercer-Vale specification as prior work belonging to Ruth and Agnes's partnership successors, and referred the fire, water diversion, arson, and witness coercion evidence for criminal inquiry. Ownership of Agnes's half required separate settlement because she left no blood heir. But Miriam produced Agnes's will from St. Orison's. It assigned her tools, notes, and interest in any process to the woman she had trained. On the condition that the knowledge be used to educate women without means, Miriam did not sell her half to Eliza. They formed a new partnership on equal terms. Harcourt's defeat did not end in a single dramatic arrest. Consequences arrived through the structures he had manipulated. His insurers refused claims connected to undisclosed chemical methods. Merchants canceled contracts after the test results became public. The county removed him as magistrate while the inquiry proceeded. Daniel Pike and Lucy testified to the recent break-in and coercion. The second guard confessed to setting the workshop fire on the foreman's orders. The foreman was found at a port attempting to leave for France and admitted Nathaniel had ordered both the arson and reservoir release. Harcourt was charged with conspiracy, property destruction, and interference with the watercourse. His father was dead and could not answer for the old fire. But the official record cleared Samuel Reed and named Edmund Harcourt as its probable cause. Nathaniel avoided the longest sentence by surrendering business records and pleading guilty to the recent offenses. He lost his county offices, paid restitution, and served imprisonment. The Harcourt mills did not pass magically to Eliza. Creditors divided them, and hundreds of workers faced unemployment. Eliza refused to celebrate their suffering. Brackenford could employ only 12 people that winter. She and Miriam persuaded the Textile Guild to lease one sound Harcourt building as a cooperative finishing house. Former Harcourt workers bought shares through small deductions from future wages. The arrangement was imperfect and heavily supervised, but it prevented one man's fall from becoming an entire town's hunger. Cedric completed his cloth contract and received every yard promised. He never became warm. Yet, he testified publicly to Arthur's letter and transferred Jonathan Vane's disputed share of the factory without payment. Mrs. Vane returned Eliza's wedding ring. Having quietly purchased it from the pawnbroker, Eliza did not put it back on. She melted the gold into two small nameplates placed above the laboratory entrance, Ruth Mercer and Agnes Vale. Victory did not repair the roof. On the morning after the ruling, Eliza returned to find ice inside the counting room and two vats cracked by frost. Orders had increased overnight, but orders required wool, coal, labor, and time. Reporters called the process a fortune. Mrs. Reed pointed to the broken vats and said fortunes usually held water. Eliza rebuild the spring gate and make the western rooms fireproof. She resisted pressure to restore the grand eastern facade. Forsyth designed a modest new roof over half the hall, using sound surviving walls and leaving the rest enclosed as a courtyard. Gideon estimated 6 months. It took a leave-in. Heavy snow delayed timber. Lime prices rose, and one newly set beam split after a hidden flaw opened. Each delay appeared in the public ledger. No one could claim that mysterious wealth rebuilt Brackenford overnight. The blue itself entered commerce slowly. Miriam insisted that no merchant receive exclusive control. Brackenford licensed the process to 3 small workshops on conditions of safe handling, fair wages, and contribution to a training fund. Licensees learned the sequence in person. They could not merely purchase a paper. The formula was registered under the Mercer-Vale name, but the teaching method became its strongest protection. Within a year, 14 women who had previously worked only as uncredited helpers qualified as dyers. Lucy Dane proved especially skilled at judging fermentation by scent. Thomas preferred machinery. Under Gideon's supervision, he rebuilt the agitation system above ground where it could be inspected and repaired. Instead of concealing one wheel beneath stone, he constructed 3 smaller paddles driven by the restored channel. If one failed, the others continued. Mrs. Reed became Brackenford's bookkeeper and refused the respectful title of manager because, she said, the books already gave her enough authority. Every worker received a weekly wage and a small share of annual profit after repair reserves. Eliza's first proposal had offered herself a larger share because she owned the land. Mrs. Reed crossed it out. Your mother and Miss Vale lost everything when ownership and labor were treated as separate truths, she said. Eliza accepted the correction. She retained the deed, but the productive business belonged jointly to those whose hands sustained it. The arrangement faced opposition. Some merchants said women trained at Brackenford would become disobedient. One licensed workshop attempted to reduce wages after obtaining the process. Eliza suspended its license. Even though the lost fee delayed construction for a month, the owner threatened suit, then yielded when his own workers refused to prepare the living bath without fair terms. Knowledge shared honestly had created bargaining power no locked room could provide. The public benefit reached beyond employment. The stable blue required clean, carefully measured water. Brackenford workers began testing village wells, first to protect dye batches, and then because they noticed one pump carried the same mineral contamination that had ruined Eliza's first black yarn. The source was runoff from an abandoned Harcourt ash pit. Children living nearby suffered recurring stomach illness. The parish had ignored complaints because the water looked clear. Eliza's records showed changes in hardness and acidity after rain. Forsyth ordered the pit sealed and the well relined. Miriam's students created simple color strips that households could use to identify unsafe changes. The strips did not replace proper inspection, but they gave poor families evidence officials could not easily dismiss. Ruth and Agnes's work, begun to free small dyers from expensive imports, now helped protect the town that had once abandoned them. Harcourt's former mansion was sold to cover restitution. Eliza never entered it. She did not need to stand in his drawing room to measure justice. She saw it in Samuel Reed's corrected death record, framed above Mrs. Reed's desk. She saw it when Lucy signed her own wage receipt instead of making a mark. She saw it when Thomas rejected an offer from a London mill because Brackenford agreed to fund his study of water mechanics 2 days each week. The most difficult reconciliation concerned Arthur. His letter had helped win the case, but it did not transform him into a brave man. He had accepted Harcourt's money, hidden truth from his wife, and acted only when death protected him from consequences. Eliza refused both the Vane family's wish to praise him as a secret hero and the newspaper's desire to portray him as a complete villain. Above a copy of his letter in the archive, she placed a short statement. Arthur Vane inherited a wrong, profited from silence, and finally chose to return evidence to the person best able to use it. His last act was just. It did not erase those before it. Cedric read the statement and called it severe. A week later, he sent Eliza the remaining pages from Arthur's account books. Perhaps accuracy was the closest their family would come to apology. Mrs. Vane visited once more during the second spring. She stood before Ruth's and Agnes's gold nameplates and asked whether Eliza hated her. Eliza considered the question. Hatred would have kept Mrs. Vane at the center of a story she no longer owned. I remember what you chose, Eliza said. What you choose now belongs to you. Mrs. Vane later endowed 2 places at Miriam's school, without placing the Vane name on them. Eliza neither forgave nor rejected the act. Restitution did not require affection. During the 3rd year, workers clearing the last rubble from the underground chamber found Agnes's missing shoe where Eliza had first seen it. Behind the loose heel was a folded sliver of linen. Ruth had written a message in blue mineral ink. If either of us survives, the work must not become another locked inheritance. Teach the hands that are refused a place. The sentence was not legal evidence. The hearing was long over. It mattered more as an instruction. Eliza placed it beneath glass in the training room. Beside the matching mittens, visitors often lingered over the display expecting a map to treasure. The treasure was harder to explain. It was a method saved by 2 women, a dead mechanic's courage, a widow's memory, an apprentice's persistence, and a community's decision to value truth after years of accepting convenience. Brackenford never became the largest dye works in England. That was not failure. It became known for colors that lasted, records that could be examined, and workers whose names appeared beside the processes they improved. The eastern courtyard filled with woad, meadow, veldt, and experimental plants gathered from local hedgerows. The burned bricks were cleaned but not hidden. A black line remained across the tallest wall, marking the height of the old fire. Beneath it, Miriam's students painted small, numbered squares corresponding to every failed trial that led to the restored blue. Trial 34 was not presented as a miracle. It was shown as the result of 33 honest failures. Gideon lived long enough to see the new water wheel turn. At the opening ceremony, officials invited him to cut a ribbon. He refused and handed the scissors to Mrs. Reed. She cut it beneath Samuel's corrected record while Thomas started the wheel. Water moved through the visible channels, set the paddles turning, and stirred 3 blue vats at once. Gideon died peacefully the following winter. His tools remained in the workshop with a notice permitting any apprentice to use them after learning how to sharpen and return them properly. 5 years after Eliza first walked through the flooded yard, a girl named Ada Pierce arrived with a carpetbag and a letter from Miriam. Ada was 19, dismissed from a fashionable cloth house for experimenting with waste fibers without permission. Her employer described her as proud, unmanageable, and better suited to factory sweeping than design. Eliza recognized the language used whenever powerful people wished to make talent sound like misconduct. She did not promise Ada success. She gave her a bench, safety rules, a wage for cleaning equipment, and 2 afternoons each week for supervised trials. Ada's first 6 colors were ugly. Her 7th produced a warm green from nettles and copper, recovered from worn machinery. She expected Eliza to claim it for Brackenford. Instead, Eliza opened the registration book and asked her to write her own name. That evening, Eliza walked alone to the lower laboratory. It had been stabilized, but never returned to secrecy. Wide steps replaced the narrow passage. Ventilation shafts opened to the courtyard, and glass panels allowed visitors to see the spring channel. Only one original vat survived. Its rim still carried the dark blue crust that first answered her candle. Eliza set Ruth's journal beside it. Conservators had strengthened the binding, but the cut pages remained absent. She no longer resented the gaps. Everything needed to understand the process had existed in people. Water, cloth, records, and work. No single book had ever contained the whole truth. Thomas found her there and said the final daylight was ready. They went upstairs. Workers gathered in the courtyard holding a length of newly woven cloth. It had been made from moorland wool, dyed by the newest apprentices, washed by Lucy, tested by Miriam's student, and purchased by the county hospital for nurses' winter cloaks. Eliza carried one end while Ada held the other. At first the fabric looked nearly black. Then the clouds moved, and late sunlight entered through the roof glass. Blue traveled across the cloth, deepened, and opened toward violet. The change drew the same quiet wonder Eliza had felt over the scrap beneath the burned cabinet. Mrs. Reed stood beside Samuel's name. Miriam stood beneath Agnes's. The blackened wall rose behind them, neither erased nor allowed to define what the factory had become. Eliza thought of the will reading and Cedric's laughter, of Mrs. Vane offering exile, of Harcourt placing the duplicate key on the table. They had believed worth came from controlling doors, dates, money, and other people's silence. Ruth and Agnes had understood something stronger. A color endured because every stage supported the next mineral. Water, living bath, practiced hand, open air, and light. A person endured much the same way. Eliza had not restored Brackenford alone, and Brackenford had not rescued her by revealing hidden wealth. They had restored one another through work made visible and truth made shareable. When the apprentices carried the blue cloth toward the cutting table, Eliza remained beneath the open roof until the last violet edge passed into sunlight.